Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Terrace Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
Yes, I'm very excited about today's conversations. They're going into one of my favorite topics. Now, I've been traveling around the world doing world mythology. I'm covering a lot of countries that many people in America aren't familiar with, a lot of obscure mythologies. Some of them so rare and hard to track down, you can almost find nothing about them on the internet. But while traveling more or less geographically, I've saved the best for last by skipping over the most popular and the most famous series of myths in the world. So I saved Norse mythology and Greek mythology for the very end.
Okay.
I want to do Norse mythology first. So I sort of saved the best for last in a lot of ways. These are the stories that many people are more familiar with, but there's still a lot about them that the average person might not know. Norse mythology is one of my personal favorites. I've been studying Norse mythology since I was a little kid because I grew up reading comic books, so naturally I read the Thor comic by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, which is a wildly inaccurate retelling of Norse mythology. Thor in the mythology really had red hair, a beard, and wasn't all that bright. But nevertheless, the stories are really fantastic. The art is great. That's vintage Lee Kirby in that one. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, after Thor became popular, went back and retold several actual Norse myths with their versions of the characters, in place of the original versions, which was kind of cool. So at least they did their research eventually. It took a few years for Thor to really catch fire. But that was my introduction to Norse mythology. That led me back to researching all the books I could find on Norse mythology. The best book I found on Norse mythology until recently was Norse Myths by Kevin Crosley Holland. I have that in my young adult section. It was one of the things I purchased when I got this job to make sure I had one of the best Norse mythology books on the shelf. This is one that scholars go back to again and again. It's very well done. And it may even stand up. However, I can't say that's like the best story of the Norse mythology because Neil Gaiman, remember Neil Gaiman? We've talked about him before. When we did urban fantasy and things like that, we discussed Neil Gaiman, and I said, we'll discuss Neil Gaiman again. Well, now here we are. We're discussing Neil Gaiman again because Norse mythology is also Neil's favorite mythology. You can't really have a favorite mythology, as he says in his introduction, but if he did, it would be Norse mythology. He wrote the book on Norse mythology, which he even called Norse Mythology. It basically took the best versions you could find of all the most popular Norse myths, of all the gods of Asgard and so forth, and retold them as only Neil Gaiman can. So it's pretty brilliant. Also, the audiobook is in the library as well. The audiobook is read by Neil Gaiman, so it's like him literally sitting there and telling you all the stories himself.
That's pretty cool.
Gaiman is a master storyteller, so he brings these tales to life. He's also used the world of the ancient Norse, ancient Norway in this case, for a fiction book, Odd and the Frost Giants. It's one of Gaiman's books that's not as popular, possibly because it's short and it might be dismissed as being a children's book, although I read it and I really enjoyed it. It's about a 12-year-old kid in Norway who is lame after a tree fell on him, and his father died while on a raid, so he really kind of has a rough life. Everybody picks on him because he just doesn't have what it takes to make a true Viking. He's constantly told by the bigger kids. But while going through the woods, he runs into 3 talking animals who have a big problem they need someone to solve. It may not be the toughest Viking who comes to their aid, but he just may be smart enough to save the gods from a terrible curse. So that's Odd and the Frost Giants. But of course, it's not just Neil Gaiman who loves the Norse gods. Rick Riordan, who wrote the very famous Percy Jackson series about the Greek gods, decided to expand his universe. And so we discovered that other gods are active in the world aside from the Greek gods. He's done the House of Cain series involving the Egyptian gods. But even more famously, he's done the Magnus Chase series, in which someone discovers he's actually the offspring of an Asgardian god. And so he goes off on an epic quest. And for Percy Jackson fans, it's highly recommended. It's another look at a world in which magic works very differently. The Norse gods are very different from the Greek gods, and Riordan has done his homework. You can definitely tell the difference in the feel of the two stories. However, they're all set in the same universe, so Percy Jackson actually shows up and makes a cameo appearance in the Magnus Chase series.
When you say that he's done his homework, what authority are you going to do said homework and to confirm?
The stories have been written down. There's a tremendous amount of material out there about the Norse gods. So as I'll get to in a minute, there's also a lot that we don't know. But Reardon brings up ways of looking at things that indicate he's actually done the research. He doesn't automatically accept everything he's read in a myth as being true in his universe. He does what's better for storytelling purposes. The same way Neil Gaiman picked and chose which version of what story he wanted to tell. There's 3 or 4 versions out there of some of the famous stories. But putting in enough little details tells you that he really has done his work, like how runes work and magic in their universe and things like that. And Reardon definitely knows his stuff. Norse mythology is still popular with the general public. It resonates very strongly with our society for a number of reasons. They're really classic adventure stories. You can look at them completely removed from any context, and they're stories about heroes and monsters and beautiful women and lots of gold and magic super weapons and so forth. It's easy to see why Lee and Kirby felt that Thor would be a good superhero, because there is that superhero quality to some of the Norse myths. Also, the Norse gods are still being actively worshipped.
That was actually my next question.
Yes, they are. There are plenty of pagans in the world, and many of them have followed the path of the Norse gods. They are still actively worshipped. I've known a few of them myself, and they take their religion very seriously. Unfortunately, Norse mythology has also been co-opted by white supremacists. The Nazis in the real world were fascinated by Norse mythology because it originally came from the Germanic tribes of Europe. So they saw that as being a pagan, like true way of being German, as opposed to the Christian way of being German. And so the Nazis sought back in time to find a better way of being Aryan. However, their understanding of Norse mythology was really kind of limited. But in modern times, neo-Nazis and skinheads and white supremacists of all stripes are flocking to the Norse banner. I think they're vastly misinterpreting the Vikings, who they did conquer a lot of people, and they conquered non-white people occasionally. However, they were a lot more diverse and culturally rich group of people than history gives them credit for. The depictions of them in most movies and TV shows and things like that are not terribly accurate. I suspect if Odin were to come to Earth today, he would have very little patience with your typical skinhead. Norse mythology has had a huge influence in the world of literature. I've already discussed Neil Gaiman. J.R.R. Tolkien was also a scholar of the Norse myths, and he borrowed a lot from Norse mythology for his Lord of the Rings books. In one of the books, they list the names of the dwarves who live in the land of the dwarves, and almost all the names wind up being used by dwarves in Tolkien stories. And it resonates a lot with me too, because I tell stories of the Norse gods. I used to do some storytelling, and I have a big story that retells one of the Norse myths surrounding Loki, a very popular god. And I also do role-playing games set in universes where the gods are real. And you can't do anything involving gods without you having the Norse gods pop up. Because they're so popular, they're so famous, everybody knows them. Even if you only know the movie versions of them, you've still got kind of an inkling of what they're like, even though that's very much a shadow of their true selves. So they're very cool. I like them a lot. Do you know how much do you know about the Norse gods?
How do you measure that?
I mean, you know, like Odin and Thor and those things, just from having heard about the movies, even if you haven't seen the movies.
Well, between my husband and 2 sons, I've seen all the movies.
Yeah. The Norse gods pop up in computer games all the time because it's really good for storytelling purposes. Heroes fight monsters and that sort of thing. When you study the Norse myths, a couple of things you have to remember. First of all, we're viewing everything through a lens. Now, this has been true of every mythology that I've talked about. These were all originally stories that were given orally. They were told by storytellers, and they weren't written down for centuries. So these existed in various forms for a long time before anyone wrote them down on paper. So right away, we've lost a lot of different versions of the stories. Now, Norse mythology was originally Germanic mythology. The various Germanic tribes that occupied Europe for a long time worshipped these gods that had these names, and they eventually emigrated and moved north. They moved into Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, and they developed their own version of the Germanic gods that we know as the Norse gods. But Odin was originally Woden.
Oh.
And before that, he was Wotan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Wotan, with an N, was probably a very different deity than the guy who later evolved into Odin, from Norway.
How so?
We don't know, because the Vikings, after they were Christianized, started writing things down, and the Germanic tribes got exterminated, first by the Germans, and then absorbed into the various city-states that developed, and never wrote things down. There are hints that there are dark practices in ancient Europe that involves these gods, but all we have are hints and various stories about them. But it's guesswork, because no story about Wotan was ever written down. There was Donar, the god of thunder, who was his son, who eventually became Thor. But again, it's a very different versions of all of these characters. But we'll never know because they weren't written down. Also, these are extremely pagan stories. One of the reasons why people are drawn to them is that they have a way of looking at the world that's very distinct and unique and very different from Western culture. However, they weren't written down until the Christians arrived and started Christianizing the Vikings. Most of the myths that we have come from what's called the Prose Edda, which was written by Snorri Sturluson.
I just have to back up for a sec.
Yes.
I wouldn't have guessed that Vikings would have been easily Christianized.
They were. And not easily. It was a gradual process over a period of hundreds of years. Exactly when the last Viking raid occurred is a matter of some speculation. And also depends on how you define the Vikings. The Vikings are defined by going out and attacking people in their longboats. But if they seized control of a place and settled there and started planting crops and building farms, were they still Vikings or were they just settlers?
Right.
Normandy in northern France is called that because that's where the Normans landed. The Normans were what the French called the Norse. So Normandy was Viking.
Didn't realize that.
Yeah. And in 1066, when William the Conqueror attacked England, guess where he came from? Normandy. So technically, that was a Viking invasion of England in 1066.
Wow.
But were they really Vikings at that point? Now, one of the interesting things about Norse mythology is that its influence is everywhere, but it's also subtle. Are you aware that most of the names of our days of the week come from the Norse gods?
Certainly not.
Yes. Tuesday is named after Tyr, the one-handed god of war. Wednesday was Wotan's Day, or Odin's Day. Guess what god Thursday commemorates?
Really?
Thor.
Very cool.
And Friday was Frey. Saturday, however, was named after Saturn, the Roman god. Why the Norse didn't take Saturday, I don't know. Best day of the week, and they totally left it alone. Because those are English names for the days, and the English language was affected tremendously by William the Conqueror when he took over. When the Normans conquered England, they changed the Anglo-Saxon language into what we have today. And the names of the days somehow got stuck and remained more or less unchanged to present times.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when Neil Gaiman's American Gods and a mysterious stranger shows up and says he's Mr. Wednesday, you should know you're in trouble. So Snorri Sturluson wrote down the Norse gods, the Norse myths, after being Christianized.
Okay.
He did this around 1200 AD. So There's a strong possibility he left off a lot of the darker, more violent ones because he knew it just wouldn't be tolerated in this new Christianized world he was moving into. He also wrote down mostly stories about the male gods. And we don't know whether he just didn't have access to the stories of the goddesses, or whether he just chose not to tell their story. The Norse mythology has a lot of cool goddesses. They have a bunch of them. But sadly, there's a large group that exist only in a list of goddesses, and there's no stories attached to them. There's no personalities, just names and what they were in charge of. They had a goddess of love, Freya, we'll meet her, but there's also a goddess of marriage that's sometimes given to Frigga. But there's also an entirely separate goddess of personal relationships between people. But I don't know anything about her except her name, just because it was written down by Snorri. The status of women in the Viking times has been a subject of some controversy. Vikings traditionally been considered an extremely macho society. Vikings were manly men doing manly things. And the image we have of them is always the big guys with beards, with axes in their hands, usually a helmet with horns on it. A terrible thing to wear into battle. Never wear a helmet with horns on it. But it's always exclusively male. There was even a feeling for a long time when I was growing up that women were second-class citizens in the Viking Age and had, no rights whatsoever. It turns out that's actually completely wrong. That was medieval Europe, where women were second-class citizens. The Vikings had actually outgrown that. In the Viking times, women could own land, and they could divorce their husbands. And when they divorced their husbands, they could take the things that they personally owned with them. Mm-hmm. So if a woman had gotten land, like as part of her dowry, when she married her husband, when they split up, she took the land with her. Mm-hmm. Now, it would be until the 1800s when that was true in England. So the Vikings were ahead of their time in a lot of ways. The Vikings had a form of government which called the All Thing, in which the leaders would all get together, all of them, and be able to talk to the High King about any grievance. And any person had the right to petition to be heard. Literally any person could. So women, although they were in many ways second-class citizens, they also were treated with a tremendous amount of respect in Viking society. In a sense, you had to treat them with respect for a couple of reasons. First of all, women were associated with magic. That wasn't considered to be a bad thing in a Viking society. They felt it was just natural that women would turn to magic. In fact, Odin was criticized for casting a lot of spells. Other guys said, that's women's work, Odin. Yeah. Reading runes and foretelling the future. That was stuff that women were expected to do. So, anyone you meet could be a soothsayer, could cast a spell on you. You never knew. Also, there's the idea of the female Viking, the woman warrior, the shield maiden, as they call them. For a long time, there was that myth of the Viking fighting woman, and it became such a popular myth, it was dismissed by a lot of anthropologists as being just a male fantasy. But they're finding out these days that that's really not true. There were women who went to battle alongside men. The Vikings did more than just raid people. They did raid, but they also traded. And going through burial sites in old Viking settlements, they're finding plenty of bones of women there. And that was true whether it was a raiding party or whether they were setting up a new trade route. Mm-hmm. Everywhere that men went, women were with them. We don't know how many women went to battle. There was obviously no social thing against it. If a woman wanted to fight, there were several famous women in history, one of which is immortalized in the current series, The Vikings, who did fight alongside their men and were famous for their own battle prowess, irregardless of their male counterparts. So it did happen. How often it happened, we don't know. There was one site in England where they were digging up the site of the battle and finding all the bodies and examining the skeletons. In that raid, 1/3 of the attackers were women, mm-hmm. which is an unusually high number, but not shocking for Vikings to do that. And the other reason why women got mucho respect in society is that in a lot of ways, without being given the reins of power, they were the ones who were really in charge. If you think about it, the guys get in their longboats and they sail away for a long time. So guess who raises the cattle, plants the crops, raises the children, repairs the hole in the roof, fends off the invaders who attacked the farm while the guy is gone. Yeah, it's the woman.
Yeah.
The women ran the farms, and the women ran the villages when the men were off doing manly things. So in a lot of ways, Viking society was a very female-centric society, not on paper, but in reality, in the day-to-day reality of it, a lot of things were just plain run by women. And again, that was light years beyond what was going on in like Europe at the time. So Norse mythology. One reason why it resonates so strongly with us is that these stories are really good stories. And these are and you can tell a storytelling people because the Norse myths are the kind of myths, the stories that you tell on long winter nights when it's like way too cold to go outside and hunt, or the kind of stories you tell when you're in the middle of a long boat in the Atlantic Ocean and it's going to be days or weeks or months before you reach land. These are the stories that you tell each other. And they all have that feel to them. And they come from a harsh country and were written by a harsh people. And there's that sense of darkness and foreboding to them that is kind of unique to myths. In fact, one thing that's absolutely unique to Norse mythology is the fact that they believed in cycles and that this is all going to come to an end one day. Now, other things, like the Aztecs also believed in cycles. They had the first sun and the second sun and so forth. But they didn't have a whole myth surrounding how the world will end. The Norse did. I'll get into later exactly how this myth developed, but the Norse gods, when you think of Odin and Loki and Thor and everything, these are all gods who knew they were going to die. You know, Zeus and Apollo and Hermes would never die. They'll always be there. They're immortal. The Norse guys were really super tough, but they were going to die. One day they would die. It is prophesied, it is foretold that one day they will die, a prophecy that cannot be beaten or outwitted, although Odin tried. And they had this doom hanging over them that makes them absolutely unique. So when you hear these stories, remember, these are people who all know their own death is coming, despite being all-powerful. And the Norse people who worshiped these gods, they feared their gods, they respected their gods, but they didn't always like them all that much. There's no effort on the part of the Vikings to make their gods all that likable. They did terrible things sometimes. One person, Kevin Crosley Holland, said that people invent gods to explain the way they already act. So Vikings wanted a god who would understand if you went a little crazy and killed a lot of people that you probably shouldn't have killed. They wanted gods who would say, I've been there, bro, you know? And that's what the Norse gods were to them. So like all great mythologies, it has an origin story. This is the origin story. In the beginning, there were only like two things that existed. There was Niflheim, which was cold. It was colder than cold. It was nothing but ice, a whole universe of nothing but ice. And then you had Muspelheim, that was made of fire. It was fire and boiling lava, incredibly hot, like the surface of the sun. And between these two worlds, you had this area that came between them, called, if I can get this right, Gnunga Gap. Gnunga Gap. Remember that if you're playing Scrabble and you have way too many G's? Yes, so Gnunga Gap was the gap. It's known as the yawning chasm. And that's the area between hot and cold. Now, the two areas were close enough together that the heat was constantly melting the ice of Niflheim. So you had all the water like swirling around. It made steam. Glaciers broke off and flowed down into Gnunga Gap. And as the glacier melted, something emerged from it. And it was Ymir, the first living creature. Ymir was a giant whose size was beyond imagination. The largest thing that ever lived. He was a frost giant. Snorri says he was born evil, which is quite an announcement. Ymir was created, he was alive, and he wound up giving birth. There was like a swelling under his arm that grew, and eventually a frost giant dropped off. We call him a giant, but he's actually like much smaller than Ymir, of course, who is the father of all the giants. And so various like parts of his body would like swell up and fall off and become a whole race of giants. So more and more of this glacier melted. And in the swirling water and steam, another creature appeared. Adumla. Adhumla. Although Crosley Holland spells it without the H. Adumla was a giant cow with no horns. A cow with no horns, larger than any animal that ever lived. She just like bursts her way out of the melting ice. So you have a giant and a cow. And that's all there is in the entire universe. So the cow produces milk, which the giants live off of, which was fortunate because there was nothing to eat. There was nothing but swirling, fog and bubbling, melting water. So the cow, for food, goes back to the glacier and starts licking it like a salt lick. And as she licks, her tongue forms things on the ice. And she gradually shapes out a face. And then eventually, as she licks like more and more of it away, she forms an entire being. And he bursts free from the ice, comes to life, bursts free from the ice, and it is Buri, the first of the gods. So this is a race of gods who were licked into creation by a giant cow.
Licked into existence.
They were licked into existence by a giant cow. So several more gods are created like this. And then the gods were there, and they started getting busy with some of the female giants. Although the giants are frequently described as being very ugly, that does not stop gods from falling in love with the women, which is the exact same myth we see in the Fomori with Celtic mythology.
Right.
The Fomori were also monstrous and evil, but the women were just so gorgeous that the Celtic gods couldn't resist them. And the giants are exactly the same way, for whatever reason, probably because it's guys telling these stories, and the women are always beautiful. So you have a race which is like part giant and part god. So so Ymir is still there, and Ymir is causing a lot of trouble. Ymir is very abusive. He was born evil. And he encourages the frost giants to constantly wage war on the gods. Even though they're related by blood, war erupts between them, kind of a civil war. So by this time, there have been several generations of gods. Three of the most prominent, the last generation to be born before the universe was created, there were three brothers. They were named Vili, and Odin. Mm-hmm. They'll resonate throughout time. So Vili, and Odin didn't really want to grow up being bullied by a gigantic frost giant their entire immortal lives. So they led a rebellion. They started a war, and they attacked the frost giant, killed him, and they wound up murdering Ymir. They killed the largest thing ever to live. And when they were done, guess what they did? You've heard the story before. They chopped up the body, and they threw his skull up into the heavens, where it became the sky. And they took the fires of Muspelheim and tossed that up, and that became the stars. And they took his body and stretched it out and made that into the earth. And then they piled his bones up to make the mountains, and his salty tears filled the oceans, and so forth and so on. Exactly like the Babylonians did to Tiamat after they killed her. They made the universe from the body of a dead giant.
Did the Navajo also do something similar?
Yes, the Navajo did it too. It happened several different creation myths, and most of the people had no contact with each other.
Right.
It's just one of those things that you make a universe out of a dead giant god. It's just something that different people all over the world have come to as a thing that has happened. So they've done this, and so now there's just them, and there's still nothing but swirling fog and boiling water, but there's stuff that's melted off of the glacier while the battle has been going on. And so they find a couple of logs, and so Odin and his brothers grab an ash log and an elm log, and they start carving them. And they carve the ash log into a man and the elm into a woman. Elm is as strong as ash, but more flexible. But ash is the one you pick when you want to make a tool or a good handle for a sword. So, and Odin breathed life to them. And so that's why he's called the All-Father, so he created all living things. So one by one, they went around creating everything that lived in all of existence. So in the swirling waters that they created, something grew. Now that there was something for it to grow on, now that there was an earth, there was grass and there was plants and so forth. And from the ground, from the swirling waters of creation came Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil was the largest tree that's ever existed, largest tree that ever could exist. It is a mighty ash tree. It stretches throughout all of creation. It's watered by the Norns. It stretches up higher than can possibly be seen. The Needhog is constantly gnawing away at its roots, trying to kill it and destroy the universe. But fortunately, he's being constantly harassed by Ratatosk, the squirrel, who runs up and down the tree, constantly teasing and taunting him and distracting him, so the Yggdrasil will never be destroyed. The Norns are tending the Yggdrasil to make sure that it remains in place. The Norns are 3 priestesses who can reveal the past, explain the present, and also foretell the future. They are virtually identical to the fates from Greek mythology that we'll meet later. Almost line by line identical. Now, it is possible that the Norse encountered enough people who still remember the ancient Greek myths that they lifted them wholesale. The Vikings are very good raiders. So it's possible the Norns come directly from Greek mythology. By the way, the person who's in charge of the land of the dead, who we'll get to in a second, is referred to as Hela, and she lives in Hell, which sounds suspiciously similar to hell. As I said, the Vikings were great at stealing things. So you have this giant tree, the Yggdrasil. It is so giant that 9 worlds hang on it. They're called the 9 worlds, but they're really 9 entire universes that hang like gigantic fruits on this tree that's the size of all creation. And these 9 worlds are where everything will be set, because that's all that there is in the universe. The uppermost one is Asgard. And Asgard is where the gods settled. The gods call themselves Aesir, not Asgardians, as Stanley would have us say. They call themselves Aesir. And that is where they built Asgard, the mightiest city in all the universe. Now, close to that is Alfheim. Alfheim is the land of the elves, the light elves to be specific. They don't figure prominently in a lot of myths, but I always imagine them looking exactly like Legolas, because this is where Tolkien lifted the idea of the elves from. So yes, Tolkien elves live in Alfheim. This is followed by Midgard. Midgard is the earth. That's where we live. You can imagine our entire planet, our entire solar system, our universe, and all the stars in the sky is just dangling on the one branch of Yggdrasil. So below that there is Jotunheim, or Jotunheim, because I think I'm not supposed to pronounce the J, even though I learned to pronounce it when I was like 10 years old, and I've always called it Jotunheim. That's the land of the giants. You do not want to go there unless you're a Norse god, with a trusty hammer preferably. That is the home of the frost giants and the hill giants. And the frost giants have never forgotten how they were defeated back during the dawn of time. Near them is Vanaheim, which is the home of the Vanir. Now the Vanir are another race of gods who aren't the Aesir. The Vanir are fertility gods. They're in charge of the seasons and rainfall and giving birth and having wonderful crops and things like that. It's presumed that the Vanir were a group of gods, a pantheon, a totally separate pantheon, worshipped by a different race of people. But since we're talking about Vikings, you can imagine what happened to them. So the Vanir are in Vanaheim. Next is Svartalfheim. Svartalfheim is a dark land. It's home to the dark elves. Now it's also home to the dwarves. In actual Norse mythology, dark elves and dwarves are used interchangeably. But if you've ever played D&D, you will want to make the dark elves a totally separate race from the very cool dwarves who smith things and pound things with their hammer. And you'd be totally justified in doing that, because they play such a small role in Norse mythology. And when dwarves pop up in various things, like the Nibelung, the Ring Saga, they're exactly like the dwarves that Tolkien lifted for Lord of the Rings, which were then used in D&D. So you can assume they're Tolkien and D&D dwarves, and the dark elves live there too, in Svartalfheim.
Okay.
Below that is Niflheim, which is a land of mist. And it's so mysterious, no one knows anything about it. Supposedly, no one lives there. I'll do more research, but as of right now, I can't find anyone who lives in Niflheim.
I feel like someone went to a great
I-
deal of trouble to
Yeah.
create that false.
It's unlikely to have 9 worlds and just have one that goes to waste.
Yeah, no.
So next to that is Muspel, or Muspelheim, which is the home of Surt, the fire giant. As the home of all the fire giants, Surt is the biggest of them all. This is a land that's constantly on fire. The ground is red hot. There's like molten lava instead of water flowing. Surt sits on his huge like lava throne with a giant flaming sword. At the end of all things, Surt will rise from Muspelheim with his flaming sword and strike and set fire to Yggdrasil, and he will burn Asgard down to the ground. We see a somewhat more comical interpretation of Surtur in the movie Thor Ragnarok. That is, in fact, Surtur that does that comedy bit in the opening of the movie. The last and the most terrifying of all is the land called Hel, which is ruled by Hela. Hela is a goddess of death. And this is where the people go if they die and they didn't die in battle. If they died a coward's death, they wind up in hell. And hell is a place where there's like food set in front of you, but whenever you reach out with like a fork, it disappears, and that kind of thing. So they live there just to be tortured and tormented by Hela, who is kind of a mean, bitter sort of hag. In the most popular version of her story, she's one half an extremely attractive woman, and the other half is a rotting corpse.
Oh.
She's made very hot in the Thor comic book series.
The one half.
Both of them. She has her both halves united in the Thor comic book series, and she's played by Cate Blanchett in the movie. Does a pretty good job with her. She's not someone you want to cross. You won't ever go there unless you've died badly or you have some kind of really dangerous quest that sends you there, in which case you don't want to mess with her. Mm-hmm. So those are the 9 worlds that exist. It's all of existence. All the stories I'm going to tell will take part in these 9 worlds. What do you think so far?
So the end story that you said was unique to this...
Ragnarok.
And so it's just everything gets burnt down?
Everything is destroyed.
With fire?
Yes. In some versions, there's another creation where things are started up again. We'll get to that when I cover Ragnarok. The fact that the Norse myths have a beginning, middle, and end period. When Neil Gaiman said that when he was assembling his book, the stories seemed to fit together remarkably well, like they were all supposed to be told in this order.
Interesting.
Because everything builds towards Ragnarok.
So you said it was unique. Is it entirely unique?
Several myths have endpoints.
Okay.
But none of them have such an elaborate story building up to it.
Okay.
There are certain things that have to happen for Ragnarok to occur. And there are times when the gods try to beat their destiny, and there are times they just accept it. Loki, for instance, will turn on them at the end of time. When Ragnarok occurs, Loki will not be on the side of the gods. And yet, this has been foretold, and yet Loki lives in Asgard and spends all his time hanging out in the mead hall with his buddy Thor, his half-brother. And no one ever thinks to just stab him in the back.
So if you're not on the side of the gods, you're on the side of...
The side of evil. Hela will leave Hel. Surt will leave Muspelheim. The Fenris wolf will be unleashed, will devour the world. Thor will die fighting the world serpent. It's a snake so big it encompasses the entire earth.
And it's evil.
It's evil.
So Thor
Very
is good
evil.
fighting against evil. Okay.
That's what you have to look forward to. We'll cover more exciting Norse myths tomorrow. We'll see all the major players and hear some of their stories. All right?
Very cool.
So until next time, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you then, and be safe. Bye.